Hey there. I'd like to open the show on a little bit of a serious note this week. We lost one of our own in the comic podcasting community, Mr. Stevie D of the Comic Book Queers. And he was absolutely a groundbreaker, one of the first comic podcasters, and he was hilarious and an overwhelming joy to every single person who ever met him. And he really broke a lot of ground, and his endless enthusiasm for comics will never ever be forgotten. So thank you, Stevie D, and you'll never be forgotten. And as usual, DCBS, a discount comic book service where you can get 50% off all your Marvel and Image and DC trades if you're pre-ordering them right now. Go do that. As well as Black Phoenix Acme Lab. If you're hitting up Dragon Con, they have exclusive scents there to complement whatever scent note pattern you enjoy most. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day. Hey there, welcome back to Double Page Spread, and I'm your host, Miss Wendy Freeman. Tonight I am joined in the Freeman house by Mr. Zach Lehner, artist of Junior Braves of the Apocalypse. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I'm delighted. I'm always delighted to have company. This is fantastic. I'm so glad you're local. This worked out.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that we were able to do this in person. That's always so much more fun.
I know. You get body language. You get communication.
Exactly.
That's always sweet. So you just released Volume 2 of Junior Braves of the Apocalypse. Now, you are the artist.
That's me.
Yes, and the writers are Greg Smith and Michael Tanner. Man, this is a gorgeous looking book.
Well, thank you.
It's a beautiful looking book. It's definitely it's a bound hardcover. It's very nice, and I expect no less from Oni.
We do actually have two soft covers coming out too. One of Volume 1 and Volume 2. So we're doing a sort of we're softly re-releasing Volume 1 because it's been a minute since it's been out. So we're trying to make it easy for people to kind of ramp on and start reading if they haven't done before.
Yeah, and it's a young adult book, so I imagine that it's packaged well, to get libraries. And
that's the idea. That's definitely what we're shooting.
Yeah, I think that's a trend more so now, because especially with the demise of bookstores so much, you're trying to find these things, these ways to get these young adult books in people's hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you got to kind of have it more
Right, and I hear from librarians all the time that that their copies keep getting stolen, which I don't want to encourage people to steal books from libraries, but yeah, every time that happens, I'm oh hey, that's a sale. That feels good.
But you don't know they're gonna re-up. You don't know.
That's true. I don't know that.
They may just be they may not even realize it's stolen. So that's a bummer.
I mean, we hear good things from librarians, which is nice. We make an effort to go to the big American Library Association conference every year. I do a lot of local library shows, and one of the things I hear from librarians a lot is that they really need stuff to give to boys in that age group. There's a lot of stuff out there that is that they can give to girls, or that they can give to both genders, that is either aimed at at young ladies, or is sort of broad and for everybody. But there's not a lot, surprisingly, given the culture we live in. There's not a lot that is explicitly for boys in the age of 10 to 12 in this specific medium. So it's nice to be able to provide that and give young men something to read until they're ready to read The Walking Dead.
It's interesting. I was having the conversation the other day. We all know that Disney bought the Marvel properties because they have all this princess stuff, and they want something in the corner more the boy market. And I wondered, how come Disney has never marketed the princes, Disney Prince stuff as cool
wonder,
young adult stuff? Why don't you do something cool with some of those dude characters? I don't know. Yeah, they do all that Disney princess shit, and they do stuff with the animals of Disney stories.
Right.
Yeah. Why have they never tried to make a separate thing of Disney Prince marketing to boys? I don't know.
Well, it makes you wonder. I don't know. I'm sure we could get into the weeds on that. There's just,
young Prince Charming fighting dragons and shit. You could do that.
Sure, and it's just you wonder so do boys see themselves in Prince Charming? Is that who they think they are? Is that who they imagine themselves to be?
I guess not.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And, like, when you extrapolate from that, like, so do girls see themselves in, like, Jasmine? Because Aladdin was a really, like, boy-focused movie, right? So do girls see themselves in Jasmine, or do they see themselves in Rapunzel, who is, like, doesn't quite have it all together, is kind of running around, falling into one situation after another. She's not very confident.
See, but I think we all see ourselves as that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Well, and that's my point, is
right.
that, like, you don't see yourself as this idealized person. That's not who you identify with in a story.
Right.
You identify with somebody who is flawed and who is figuring things out.
Yeah, no little boy sees himself as Captain John Smith in
Exactly.
Pocahontas.
Right. Hopefully very few people do. But, like, so, like, it's just this, you identify with people who are kind of, like, stumbling through things and figuring stuff out, especially when you're young, because that's what you're doing. So when, like, you come to this place where you have to find characters that people will identify with, you don't want it to, like... It's really hard. That's why it continues to be hard to do Superman well. And everyone in every high school across the world who has read comic books has had that conversation. And, like, it's just it's a hard thing to write a character who is essentially perfect and make them relatable. That's a tangent. It has nothing to do with this book. This book is about Boy Scouts and zombies. I'm sorry, everybody.
No, I like tangents. Tangents are good. Yeah, no, so this book is about Boy Scouts and zombies.
Yes, it is.
So give us a brief pitch of Junior Braves the Apocalypse.
So I usually start with the Boy Scouts and zombies thing, and then I say, like, it's a story about a bunch of kids who go away to summer camp and they come back and the world has pretty much ended. Like, there's a bunch of undead, like, ish mutants that have overrun their town. All of their families have been evacuated. Like, any authority figures left are dead or cuckoo for cocoa nuts. So they have to use the skills they learned while away in, like, wilderness camp to stay alive in this dangerous new world. And so book one deals with them, like, kind of coming home, navigating the ins and outs of, like, their town, like, kind of coming together as a group, because they don't, like, they're just a bunch of kids who see each other on, like, a couple weekends every summer. They aren't all really very tight. So, like, they kind of come together, they become a team, they make plans to, like, head to Seattle, because they're in Oregon, and that's where everyone's going to be evacuated to. And the book ends with them kind of hiking down the road on their way, plus or minus a couple of people who they lose or pick up on the way. And then in book two is the story of that journey to Seattle and what happens on the way. And there's a lot of big set pieces as they, like, kind of travel through the woods, as, like, they continue to kind of come together and become even more of a team, as they run into, like, some other Braves who have, like, dealt with the issues presented by this big apocalypse in a very different way than they have. And have come to very different conclusions about what is important. And it's this one is a journey book, whereas the other one was more just sort of like staying alive in one tense situation.
It's interesting to me how there's sort of been this has sort of been an idea in the zeitgeist. Like, you had things like Lumberjanes and Ghoul Scouts and there's that movie Scout's Guide to the Apocalypse. Like, how do you differentiate your books so people don't confuse it with those other things?
So the first thing I'd say, interestingly enough, is that we actually predate most of those on a technical level, because like book one was made almost a decade ago. And then it didn't get on shelves for, I think, about 6 years. So we kind of, like, not to be like we were doing this before it was cool, it's just that, like, all this work was done, and then suddenly, like, we kind of came out suddenly into this market where there were all these people doing it, and, like, I don't know, zombies and Boy Scouts kind of became a thing. So, like, to answer the question of what differentiates us, I think part of it is that we're kind of shooting in a different market than most of those are. Even Lumberjanes, which, we love Lumberjanes, and, like, we're friends with, like, the folks who make it. But like, they release monthly. They do floppies. They're, like, very comic shop oriented. And I love comic shops. I just said a signing at Challengers. I love those guys. I love everybody who runs a shop. But, like, we release these big volumes. We don't release monthly. We release on a, like, yearly to 2 yearly schedule. And our goal is, like, to get into bookstores and libraries and onto people's shelves, not into people's boxes. So, we're trying to head somewhere different. And I think we're also trying to approach a slightly different crowd. Like, we don't necessarily want the diehard comics fan. We want people who don't read comics all the time, because we want this to be something that everyone can enjoy.
Let's talk about that idea of trying to write a horror comic for young adults versus adults.
Sure.
Like, how do you broach that topic? How do you make it like how scary are you willing to go?
Well, I mean, I should be, as said, like, I draw it, I don't write it.
But I mean, from a physical perspective, from
Sure.
like a visual perspective, like how much gore, what do you get away with? What do you feel you can push that limit on?
I have never gotten any pushback about how violent the book has been in terms of how it looks. So I'm usually pretty comfortable going pretty violent with it. Not that like I don't personally find like violence for violence sake to be very engaging from a storytelling perspective. So I'm not like setting out to try to make something that is like as full of blood and viscera as possible. That's not my goal when I sit down. But I also don't shy away from, like, if there's a severed arm, well, there's a severed arm. Some of the funniest moments in the books now involve like weird, like gross stuff. Like, there's a moment in book 2 when somebody drops a severed arm out of a bag, and that could be horrifying, and it is. But I like to think it's also kind of funny.
Well, also, young boys love gross stuff.
Right,
like, that's
exactly.
just a fact, You're in that age range, you like seeing, cartoonish kind of gross shit.
Right. We have this Mike and Greg are, like, they're a little older than me, and they were really, like, they're really into, like, 80s stuff. Mm-hmm. So, like, they're big on the Goonies. That's their
their touchstone.
Yeah, their tentpole idea for this is, like, Goonies, but with zombies. So, like, that same sort of, like, it's adventurous. Sometimes it's a little gross. It's definitely scary. Like, I've had adults tell me that it's given them nightmares, which amazes me, because that is not what I imagine it's about. But there's definitely moments where it's like, this is a tense situation and people are genuinely in danger. Like, I don't want to spoil anything, although I'm about to. But, like, for the people who haven't read book 1, like, a kid does die in the first 20 pages of book 1. Like, and that's there to say, like, no, everyone is at risk here.
Right, because you got to plant that the stakes are high.
Right, exactly. Right. Like, this is not a thing where everybody is going to come out okay. This is the end of the world, and even if these are kids, that doesn't mean they're safe.
Right, I wanted to ask about that. Yeah, that whole idea of, like, what is taboo? Is killing kids taboo?
Not in this book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also, generally, you think of kids on their own as ending up sort of Lord of the Flies. Like, they all turn on each other and they turn into a more brutalistic... I feel like you have to either imagine that society is either going to be, like, not utopian, but, like, either kids are going to team together or they're going to completely devolve, and you got pigs on stakes and they're chasing down fat kids and stuff, so
I mean, the fat kid's kind of in charge in this book, so that's not going to happen so much. But there's I'm familiar with that idea, and, like, to be completely honest with you, it always struck me as kind of crappy. Like, it's very condescending. It's this idea that, like, no, like, kids are inherently monsters, and, like, maybe they are, but that's not because they're kids, it's because they're people. Everybody has the potential to be a douchebag. It's not about how old you are. So, like, these kids have this, like, they grew up in this organization that kind of gives them, like a set of coda to operate on. Like, the phrase, "a brave is brave," comes up a lot. And, they, like, there is fracturing. Like, they have a hard time, their goals don't always align. But none of them is ever out, like, to get any of the others. None of that. There's no collapse of a belief in everybody being worth keeping around. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, none of them are trying to betray each other. Sometimes they have different goals, and that brings them into conflict. But there's never a question of whether or not they value each other being alive and in the world.
Yeah, so it still comes from a humanistic place.
Yeah, exactly. And there are, like, as the series goes on, we'll get more and more into how, like, this whole thing has affected, like, other areas. And we start that in book 2. There's a lot of like evidence. Book one is sort of weirdly constructed if you like read through it, of like the whole like, well, what do you tell a kid to do in an emergency? You tell them to find an authority figure. So it's like, find your parents. Well, their parents are gone. Find your teachers. Well, they find their teachers and their teachers have gone crazy. Find someone in a uniform. Well, they find people in uniforms and those people are horrible people. So like, we start to see that like there are places that are fracturing, that are kind of losing that moral center that we believe society gives us. And the journey is, at least in part, about the Braves kind of trying to bring their like remaining sense of decency and right and wrong into the world. And that's a little like, it's not a mythical journey. They're mostly just trying to stay alive. But they leave a little bit of decency behind them everywhere they go.
Right, but well, it's the ideology of being a scout, of being a brave, of being these things. It's this thing that like they're taught to survive, and they're taught this decency and this teamwork and all these things.
And that being a good person isn't something that you get to put down when things are hard. Like it's if you're gonna stop doing the right thing for a good reason, you'll stop doing the right thing for a bad one. You have to maintain some sense of right and wrong, even in the worst situations, or it never mattered to you at all.
Let's talk about the physicality of these characters.
Sure.
And sort of how you've identified each of them, where there's sort of like their physical traits and how you sort of, like, what is your technique to drawing children?
The short answer is that I make them shorter than adults and, a little smaller, but each of the boys has their own silhouette. Actually, one of my regrets in book one and a little bit in book two is that I didn't, I'm still kind of trying to make sure that their models are consistent. And that gets a lot better in book two and should continue, like by book three, it shouldn't be an issue. In book one, I wasn't really paying enough attention, and I think a couple of the boys bleed together a little bit. But in terms of like their like how they move, which is really like that's kind of where the acting comes in. Like a lot of them have little tics that they do. So like Johnny, like the young native boy, who's like he's got he always pulls his hat down over his eyes when he's nervous. Whenever he's being complimented, which he's very uncomfortable with, or whenever he's like regretful about something or nervous, he pulls his hat down over his eyes. He's very reserved. Travis, who sort of ends up being the leader of the boys because no one else kind of steps up to do it, he's kind of a bully at the start of the book. And he's very loud. He's very immature, and he's very kind of trollish. Like he's loud and he's brash, and he's always making stupid faces. And as the book goes on, he gets as the story goes on, he gets a little bit more reserved, but he's still very he's a loud person, and his stances are loud.
Well, I like the evolution of that because, so many times like there are these things we attribute to kids, or these things like, stop being so loud or whatever. But meanwhile, it's like that's also the sign of a good leader. Like it's these these certain attributes that you have to learn. Like if he could just shape that properly. He could rally people, so I like that. I like that sort of evolution, sort of like identifying these traits in young boys that are that you think of as being awful or whatever,
right? And
teaching them that you can be better.
I have a lot. Travis is one of the characters in the book that I find the most interesting because he experiences the most personal growth, especially in book one. Like he goes through this period where everybody's kind of managing him and like trying to tell him like stop, like you're being a jerk, and he as the book goes on, he starts to recognize that, and like his character kind of goes on trial, but he's still it just kind of becomes more and more evident that he's paying attention more than people are giving him credit for, and by book two, he's still not all the way there yet. But he's clearly grown into somebody who is, understands that, for whatever reason, he's the one in charge, and that means that he can't, be, like, a snarky little jerk all the time. He has to, think about what's best for the group.
And this is also something like, ADHD kids and kids who are on the spectrum and stuff. Like, these are things that they have to realize and go through in life, too.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has to... Like, compassion is not native. It's learned. And it's learned by a combination of undergoing tough situations yourself, and then once you do it, by paying attention to other people and watching how tough situations affect them. And, like, kids don't have compassion automatically. So watching, Travis in particular go through that and learn that, and he's not the only one. Johnny, has to learn to be a part of a team, and that's not easy for him because he's a foster kid. He doesn't really feel like he belongs in the place that he is. Like, he has a hard time connecting with people. And there's a lot of these situations where these boys have to just kind of, learn that lesson of where connecting with people doesn't just happen. It's something you have to work at. That's a big part of what draws me to the script, and what makes me engage with the characters when I draw it is this interest the boys gain over time in being a group. Like, they all start out as a bunch of disparate individuals who are very self-involved, and they all in their own way grow together into this team. And getting to be front row for that and be a part of making that happen is very gratifying.
Tell me about the design of the uniforms.
Sure.
So, were you a Boy Scout?
Yes, I made. I'm an Eagle, actually.
Oh my! So you got past Weebelo and all that?
Yes. Mike didn't. Every one of us was in Scouts at some point. So Mike made it to Weebelo. Greg made it to. I think Greg made it to first class. I'm not sure. And I made it to Eagle. So design. We had a lot of debates about the uniforms because one of the things I wanted to do was differentiate the characters initially based on what they were wearing. Because when I was in Scouts, you didn't go around in dress uniform all the time. And if you did, people wore their dress uniforms in different ways. You wouldn't always wear the dress pants, or maybe the little neckerchief. Not everyone would wear it. And almost no one wore their sashes all the time. Here, all the boys, at least initially, wear the same outfit all the time. And part of that is just that, their Scoutmaster Padre is kind of a hard ass. But over time, one of the things I want to do, and we sort of see this in the tribe that we introduced in Book 2, is that the boys do start differentiating. Not all the boys in the tribe in Book 2 always dress to the nines, the way Tribe 65 does. I think we had a lot of debates about the color, too. I kind of wanted them to have blue, for their shirts to be blue, on the basis that that doesn't necessarily correspond to any real-life scouting organizations that I know of.
Right.
Whereas green, which is what we ended up with, when I was in Scouts, the Venture Scouts were the scout group that you joined after you, aged out of scouting. So if you wanted to keep doing the camping and the survival thing, you went into Venture Scouts. And that was the sort of upper high school, college age thing.
Huh.
And they had green uniforms. I don't know if that's still a thing. Scouting has changed a lot since I was in it, mostly for the better.
Right, well, now they allow girls in Boy Scouts, which is pretty impressive. That's amazing.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah. And,
my grandmother would never let me be a Girl Scout because she didn't want me going door to door selling cookies or anything, so, I never got to be a Scout.
It's a nice thing to see, just tangentially. Everybody in, all the troops I was involved in as a kid, either that I was a part of or that I met, everybody wanted everybody to be involved. And it was just the folks at the top of the hierarchy saying no. Everyone at the ground level that I knew wanted other people there, but we weren't allowed to do it. It's nice to see it happening this way now. It's very gratifying to finally see that going through. And we are actually one of the exciting things about Book 3 is we're going to explore a female tribe a little bit, which is long overdue for this series, but we're finally going to get there.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a bit about Book 2 and about the other tribe that they discovered. Because obviously, one of the frustrating things that people hate about Walking Dead is they're always running these other groups, and they're either trying to kill them or whatever. No, it's they run to a group, they think they're okay, they're not what they seem. It's a formula. How do you break that formula? What is different in this book?
I mean, I think in some senses we adhere to it relatively closely. To be 100% clear, I don't think any of us has read much of The Walking Dead. Like,
here's my confession to you.
Right.
So I started reading the omnibus of The Walking Dead. I lost my place, and I just never went back.
Sure.
Because it was just like grim. It's just
it's a
grim.
lot. Yeah, it's a slog. I love Robert Kirkman. He's a great writer.
Yet it's still like the number one book every single month, like that and Saga. Like, those are like the number one books month after month after month. So it's like somebody's reading The Walking Dead, and they're all just buying it out of habit.
I mean, people are into it, and that's okay. I like.
Forgive me, listeners who are Walking Dead fans.
It's just that I think that Mike and Greg, they're really into zombie movies. That's how they get into this. Is like they're movie buffs.
Yeah, I'd wanted to know is it in black and white? Essentially, is that a Romero kind of thing? Is that kind of like what were you trying to go for?
I think that that's more a budget thing than it is anything else.
Right.
Like on my end, the zombie thing was kind of an accident for me. I've never been much of a horror guy, and I kind of just tripped into this project almost by accident, happy accident. And I just ended up drawing a lot of zombies all the time. And it turned out that people liked it. So I just stuck with it. So I come to it without a lot of the preconceived notions from knowing a lot about the canon. And I think that Mike and Greg are much more horror film buffs than they are horror comic buffs. So we might be aping The Walking Dead accidentally and just not know it. But to answer your question, I mean, it's not so much that this other group of boys isn't what they seem as it is that it's pretty obvious from the get-go that they're jerks. And they're that's a broad statement. There's a couple of them in there that are decent human beings or that have understandable motivations and where if you're not rooting for them, you're at least not rooting against them. But they're led by a real bastard. And he has sort of, it's not really a cult of personality, but he's built this, he's just got this really strong, charismatic hold over this little fief that he's built with, the help of the rest of his tribe. And, in terms of, differentiating, I think the big difference is that, he is really the focal point of, of the entire problem. He's aided and abetted, but, he's where the issue is. They're also not the only villains in the story. When they come across those folks, they also come across this other group of people who are kind of in that same town, but are off a ways, and who present a different threat for more of a Mad Max reason. There's, people need gasoline.
Mm-hmm. And, it all comes down to resources.
Right,
everything
exactly.
comes down to resources.
Exactly. So, he kind of, I feel like I'm meandering a bit here, but the point I'm making is that it's not just one group. It starts out being Tribe 65 looks at this other tribe and says look, we think what you're doing is wrong, but it ends up being it ends in this big melee free-for-all where everybody is just trying to get the one thing they need to do whatever it is that they think is important, whether that's saving people or maintaining whatever power they have that serves them, or getting the resources that they need to go do whatever other nefarious thing they're trying to do. And it kind of it starts out very orderly and devolves into complete chaos.
Well, I mean, essentially, the core of all these survivalist stories, these post-apocalyptic stories, everything comes down to resources. It all comes down to be it gasoline or energy or medicine or supplies or whatever.
Yes.
And so now in this one, you have a unique they've devised a form of currency.
Yeah, the second tribe, the tribe that Tribe 65 meets on the way, builds this sort of tiny economic system in their little kingdom. That they use to, not... Some of them say they use it to control... there's different interpretations. Some, one interpretation is they're using it to control the populace, which is accurate. But another interpretation is they're using it to partition out the resources that they have available, which is also accurate. Because, in a situation like that, you don't really have one without the other. So... there's just this this tension in the air of Lucas, who is the new kid in Tribe 65 and is sort of its moral center, is very clear that like this is wrong, this is a bad thing to do, this is like this is the definition of evil. And there's another, like, there's just this counterpoint to it of like, well, we can't just if we made everything free, we wouldn't have food soon. And like, who's going to go out and get it, right? Like, there's only so many able bodies that can go out and find stuff, and every time we do, we risk losing one of them. So we have to like ration this out somehow. And the advantage of like currency and capitalism is that at least people know, like, are able to have some control over what they need. Over, like, they're able to say, this is what I need. There's plenty of other problems. I'm sure in our current political climate, there's plenty of folks who want to, like, who have opinions on that. And I'm not taking, like, I'm not saying one thing or the other. But, like, in this situation, this was the choice that this other tribe made. And they kind of get put on the spot for it. And it becomes this real point of contention of like, what's the right thing to do here? How do you deal with a situation this like gray, where like survivability and public good is a question of like, do you partition what people can have or don't you? Do you trust people to make the right decisions?
Essentially, the book is a Scat's Guide to Socialism.
I mean, maybe. I think that I don't think it takes that much of a position, but it does raise the question of like, you know, in an oblique way, and like, you know, again, like, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's a book about Boy Scouts and zombies. It's not that like that deep, but like it does raise the question of like, how do you make that decision? How do you decide what the right... There is no right answer to that question in a situation like that. Like, there's only the least wrong answer. And, you know, arriving at that is as much a question of, like, your opinion as anything. It's what your experiences tell you. And the people making, like, these decisions are all, like, 13-year-olds with no real-world experience. So that kind of adds this other layer to it.
Now let's talk artistically. Let's talk
Sure.
about a lot of it. A lot of your style is just sort of like these, you know, thick, inky kind of lines, and it's very not like, not that it's not clean and streamlined, but I mean,
No,
like,
it's dirty.
you do, yeah, exactly.
It's totally
like
dirty.
You intentionally do it in this sort of dirty manner with
Yep.
like this lovely sort of blue tone wash. A lot of that. So like, what is your method? Tell me about your process.
Okay. So I start out with alcohol-based markers, so like Prismacolors, or I mean, I use like the Blick brand because it's cheap and I'm cheap. So I make, like, I work by hand, and I work at, I believe, I forget the measurements off the top of my head.
That's okay. It's not...
Right, but like I work at something like 9 by 10, and I measure my page, and I draw out my panels from the thumbnails, and I tape the gutters so that I don't have to worry about those. And then I make all my shapes with a 10% alcohol marker, and then I go back in, and I make revisions, and I clean the shapes, and I add detail with a 20% alcohol marker. Sometimes I go to 30% if I need to, but that's hard to scan out, so I don't always do that. And then I use a blue mechanical pencil lead to get any other like fine details that I don't have. And then I go over the whole thing with a cartridge-based ink brush pen and Repeatograph ink. And sometimes, you know, like I have a whole list of other ink tools. Sometimes I use sponges, or I have a bunch of like weird funky brushes with like weird hair tips on them. Where was I going? Oh, and I just kind of go like I use whatever tool like gets the mark I want it to. Most commonly is probably like a really scratchy squirrel hair brush that I really like, that like gets a really like dirty line. And I love dirty lines. And I kind of pull all that together, and I make this big black and white drawing, and I go really heavy on the blacks, and I do like really heavy lines because I like stuff that's chunky. And then I I go back and I clean up with acrylic wash, white acrylic wash, and if I need to, then I go back over that. The nice thing about that is that a lot of professional whiteout is still water soluble after you use it, but the acrylic gouache I can that dries it's plastic, so I can use it and then I can go back over it and then I can use it and then I can go back over it until I get what I want, or if I have if I want to get a really funky shape, I can build it up and get a texture out of it. And then when all that's done, I scan it in, and I do a bunch of Photoshop weirdness to level it out. And I, with the blue wash, and this book, as you said, has a blue wash, and that was done digitally. And I did that with a digitizing tablet in Photoshop. The last book had a green wash, and that was actually all watercolor, because I was drawing smaller, so I could fit that on my light box and make that work. Now that I'm drawing a bit bigger, I don't have that luxury, so I tone digitally.
Nice, nice. So how is this, what else have you worked on? What else, do you have any projects going on now? Or I mean, obviously, this takes so much considerable work, but you said, as you say, it's something that comes out, once a year. So what else are you working on?
I mean, this is the only real major comic project I have. I've done a couple of anthology things here and there. I think I did, a back matter comic for Oni back in, the mid-2000s once. But this is the only major comic credit I have. I do professional illustration elsewhere, the standard. Everybody does commissions and stuff, or and I get paid to paint once in a while. I do. Some of the readers might know what. Well, no, I might not be able to say that. I don't know if I'm under NDA for that, so I can't say it. But I do. I also do a lot of stuff for children's books, both illustratively, but also in a design capacity. So I've worked on a lot of children's books that people might see at Toys R Us or Barnes and Noble that were related to Disney books or some stuff for Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was all corporate. That was for a company. I've done some vector illustration for language education programs. I guess the short answer is nothing else that has is going to make a splash the way this has. Most of it's more work-a-day workman stuff. This is the big fancy thing.
Cool. Well, that's nice. That's great.
Yeah.
So you want to wrap this up? Tell me about where we can find you on social media.
Sure. So I'm on, the easiest way to find me is to go to my website, which is zlehner.com, and it's a weird last name, so it's ZLEHNER.com. And that has a link to my Instagram, which I believe is at Lehner Zach at Instagram, although I always mix that up, so that might be wrong.
Either or, it's
right.
Zach Lehner or Lehner
exactly.
Zach. It's one of those.
It's pretty consistent.
Yes. I'll put the link in. Yeah.
Right. I'm on Twitter at zlehner, and the Braves in particular. We have a Facebook page. That's where most of our stuff goes. So that's Junior Braves 65 at Facebook, and any news about the book itself, it's probably fastest to go there.
Yeah. Also, I had listened to a podcast earlier that was you and the two writers on some of the podcasts talking about Black Sad. It was
yes.
a book club. It was a book club type podcast.
Yeah.
I was I love that book. I loved hearing you all talk about that
I'm
book.
insane for Black Sad is one of my favorite books. It's just so gorgeously illustrated and
it's
so
insane.
Cinematically produced.
It's so Italian.
It really is.
It's so
it
European.
Really is. I was talking to our editor Desiree a couple months ago just about how much I wish I could work in that format. Just the...
Wait, is your editor Desiree Rodriguez?
Yeah.
Yes,
Not Rodriguez. Desiree Wilson.
Oh, okay, all right. I don't know how many Desiree editors work in comics. Go on.
But yeah, and Desiree's great, and we were she was asking me about dream projects, and I was as much I would honestly just like to work at in the European format with that just this huge page.
Yes.
Oh, it's
that
so,
heavy metal kind
right.
of
It's
Mobius
just so cool.
thing. Yeah.
And you can do so much. But with that much room, you can break the panels down so much. And my sort of artsy fartsy jerkery is coming out now. But it's just it would be so exciting to have that much latitude and be able to play that much. So maybe someday that would be nice.
Well, I hope you get to.
Thank you. Me too. And thank you so much for having me.
Trekker Talk, a fan podcast devoted to the adventures of 23rd century bounty hunter Mercy St. Clair from the pages of Trekker Comics by creator, writer, and artist Ron Randall. I'm Darren.
And I'm Ruth. We'll be discussing the stories, characters, and art in this excellent retro sci-fi adventure series, as well as having side conversations about other areas of fandom.
We hope you will join us as we travel from the dangerous back streets of New Guelph to the depths of outer space and everywhere in between.
Trekker Talk is available at podbean.com and on iTunes and Stitcher.
Find us at trekkertalk.com.
Welcome back to Double Page Spread, and I am joined tonight by one of the funniest, most endearing people I know, Mr. Luke Foster.
Well, with an intro like that, the show's only going downhill from here.
How you doing, champ?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good. You are one of my Taylornetwork brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had a whole show about Magnum P.I.
Yes, we did, and then we ended it right before they announced that they were going to be making a new one. So
Why is that?
my co-host just got too busy with life, so it's one of those things.
Man, you're never too tired to talk about Magnum.
Yeah, well, it happens. We lasted for 3.5 years, though. That's pretty good for a show where we're reviewing a 30-year-old television program.
That is pretty great. Although, there are podcasts at every show under the sun.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah, like I saw like Designing Women podcasts, and people break down like every show. I listen to, I'm going to confess, I currently listen to 2 different podcasts about The Sopranos.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. One's called Pada Bing.
Wow. So it's a proud moment.
If anyone would ever like to invite me onto a show to talk about The Sopranos, I would like that.
Well, now I feel like not launching my new Sopranos podcast. It feels like it's just a crowded market.
Yeah, it's just too crowded. It's too crowded.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe when you reboot your show to talk about the new Magnum.
Yeah, although, I'm going to have to grow a mustache because this guy, the new Magnum, doesn't have one.
What is it? Between Henry Cavill having to shave his mustache and this guy not having a mustache, why are we not encouraging the mustache? There are certain men who really make it work.
Yeah, but that was either 30 years ago or they're rarer than unicorns these days because you can't just pull off a mustache anymore.
Well, you know what I'm really a fan of?
Beards?
No, mutton chops. I love good mutton chops.
Uh-huh.
Like, why can't dudes make mutton chops work? I feel mutton chops make you look so much manlier than beards.
Well, listen, I do what I can, but employers think they're ridiculous, so I have to keep them at a certain length.
Maybe you need a job either at some sort of hip brewery or a Renaissance fair.
Well, I live in Charlotte, so I could easily do both. Well, your birthday is coming up.
It is! Yes, it is!
Is it really? I usually say that.
Oh, I thought that you, keep tabs on me.
No. The judge says I can't do that anymore.
Well, first of all, I feel like we should talk about what you are known for, aside from the Magnum cast.
Probably making Daryl roll his eyes right about now.
You are a writer and artist, and you've been doing webcomics, forever.
Yeah, almost 10 years now. Actually, 10 years next month, as a matter of fact.
That's incredible. In terms of the internet, that's remarkable.
Thank you. It hasn't been all the same comic, though. Mm-hmm. I currently do a weekly strip on Patreon called Supernatural Suburbs. I started off that one. It was supposed to be, after doing 3.5 years of an all-ages, kid-friendly comic, I wanted to exercise some different humor muscles, so I started doing a really dark comic about death and crime and whatever I wanted, starring ghosts. And then in November of 2016, the whole world went to hell, and I started making it more political, and I wish sometimes I could have less material. But yeah, anyway, if you would like to sign up for Supernatural Suburbs, like I said, I post it every Monday. It's at patreon.com/cartoonistluke, and for $5 a month, you get all the new comics and all complete access to the archive. And you should do it if for no other reason than it drives Trump up the wall when comedians make money for making fun of him. And who knows much longer I'll legally be allowed to do this before, the new Gestapo comes and shuts down the internet.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what they'll dig up in your old Twitters.
Well, listen, I never made any James Gunn style jokes, but I have expressed disapproval through tweets and retweets of the current administration. Anyway, so I do Supernatural Suburbs, and I also do I have a couple different comic books out. I have did a 4-issue miniseries called Dr. Banana's Monkey Magician, which is it's an all ages friendly 4-issue series where a magic talking monkey named Dr. Bananas goes around the world having adventures with hilarious consequences. Every issue also, you don't need to know this to enjoy the stories, but every issue is also a parody of a piece of classic literature, so you can trick young people into learning.
Right, like I love the one that's blatantly Island of Dr. Moreau.
Yeah, it's Island of Dr. Moreau and Animal Farm at the same time.
That was hilarious.
Thank you.
And I really I like the fact that Dr. Bananas, he's pretty smug.
The personality kind of formed whole cloth as I was developing what eventually became the first issue. Not everyone knows this, but Dr. Bananas, the first issue, is an adaptation of an unsold animation pilot I developed a few years ago. The studio I had pitched a few things to liked it the most of all my pitches, but not enough to buy it. So I took it, corrected what they didn't like, and adapted it into a comic, and people liked that, so I made 3 more issues. I've thought I was going to stop at 4, but I've got an idea for a 5th, so you've heard it here first, people. There may be a Dr. Bananas number 5.
Because I love the fact that he is, he's abducted that witch who stole his monkey paw.
He didn't abduct her. She's in wizard jail.
Well, he needs her periodically.
Yes. She actually, when I was developing, I realized I had no idea how to end the story. And then I realized, well, if he keeps her prisoner throughout the series, he has someone to talk to instead of talking to himself, which would get tedious after a while. So I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of brilliant. And I don't know what it says about me or my history with relationships, but most of the ones I create when I write stories are highly dysfunctional. Something like Dr. Bananas and Siobhan's utter open contempt for each other is incredibly entertaining to me.
So you tell me it's based in fact?
Well, I've never kept a witch prisoner, but if I did, that's what it would be like.
Who would win, Dr. Bananas or Dr. Strange?
Dr. Bananas, obviously. Because Dr. Bananas can literally do any magic spell that advances my plot, so he wins.
Do you consider yourself more of an artist or more of a writer? What's your...
That's funny because I became an artist out of necessity, but I've always wanted to be a writer. When I started developing, I started wanting to start making webcomics. It was actually back in 2005. I tried a few different times to get artists to work with me on projects. They'd be really excited after the first one, and then they'd never show up again. They drop off the face of the earth. So, like 3 years went by, and I still had this idea for this one comic I wanted to do, and I said, you know what, screw this. I'm just gonna have to teach myself how to draw, and let's just say the first few dozen strips are proof that I was teaching myself how to draw. But that's how I started making the comics, and after a while I started considering myself more of an artist than a writer, or at least I was equal for a while. Then I kind of instinctively thought of myself as more of an artist, but now I seem to be shifting back the other way towards more of a writer. But for the most part, I'm still drawing all the comics that I make. And I don't just draw ghosts politically, too. I also draw ghosts for spooky stories, too.
So tell me about Spooky Town.
Spooky Town is a horror anthology one-shot with 4 stories that I wrote and drew, all six-page stories. The first story is about a guy who dies, and he comes back as a ghost in time to watch his body become a zombie. The second story is a Frankenstein monster with low self-esteem, wants to be as good-looking as Hollywood's hottest heartthrob. The third story is 2 regular ghosts make fun of an orb ghost for not being interesting enough for ghost hunters to want to catch. And the fourth story is 2 haunted dolls try to they have a contest to see who can be the most terrifying. Origin of that was actually I had done the first story for a different horror anthology sometime last year, and it got cut at the very last minute. The guy was very apologetic about it. He was cool with it, but he couldn't put it in his book. So I was like, all right, well, I have this 6-page story that I have nothing to do with. And so I started putting it on my Patreon for my $10 backers, for the Golden Circle backers, as I call them. And I'm like, you know what? I could do more of these and do a one-shot. And so I did, and then I put it on Kickstarter and let the other I serialized them all for the upper tier Patreons, and then I did a Kickstarter, and the Kickstarter was successful, and now I sell it at conventions and on Comixology. Same with Dr. Bananas. Spooky Town was my 4th successful Kickstarter. My very first Kickstarter was unsuccessful, but I learned a ton from that one. So since then, I kickstarted the 2 books for a comic I used to do called Center of Somewhere, a graphic novel called Drawn Away, A Cartoonist Tours America, and then Spooky Town.
With Spooky Town, it's different because you have to try to reach out. You have to find sort of like that horror comedy niche, that sort of crossover audience.
Yeah.
Which is different than your other books.
I made the first page super bloody, so that helped. And I put in swear words too, so people would know. I mean, if one of your teaser pages is a dude getting his throat ripped out by a dog, and another one is a doll standing over a sleeping child with a knife in its hand, it's kind of an implication that it's not for the youngins.
Do you have that problem a lot because of your cartoony style?
I do and I don't. I can draw more people to my table because the kids can be interested, or they might be looking for something for their kid. But I do get also a lot of people who are just not interested in a cartoony art, in cartoony art. Excuse me, I just burped in the microphone. And that's fair, I get that, I do. Not everything's for everybody. Spooky Town, although, does have a decent amount of draw based on the premise. And, I mean, people love the title, Dr. Bananas. I've sold a lot of comics based on the title alone. But I'm pleased with the reception that Spooky Town has been getting from folks. Yeah, it's kind of funny because up until recently, horror hasn't really been my thing. It's like the genre I liked the least. And then it just kind of the first story from Spooky Town, my own worst enemy, just kind of was an idea I just had floating around for a long time that I never really did anything with. I originally, back before I shifted Supernatural Suburbs into a super political comic, it was actually going to be a story there, and I just never got to it. And that, like, the thing is, like, I read a lot of horror books now. Like, I've read, like, 30 plus Stephen King books in the last 9 months.
Oh, wow.
But the thing is, they don't scare me, and I think it's because I take anti-anxiety medication that has been, as a side effect, dampening my sense of fear. So I'll be reading it like, okay, this is an entertaining romp, but the thing I'm like, okay, I can see on paper how this is supposed to be scary.
Any important news for you this weekend?
I was at a one-day comic convention that the Girl Scouts sponsored because I have all my all ages friendly comics, and it was an interesting show. They did a lot of classes for the kids, so they actually weren't on the floor a ton, but I did all right, and the kids seemed to have fun, and it didn't cost me anything to be there, so it was cool. And this coming weekend I'll be at Raleigh SuperCon, so.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you have also been dipping your toes into prose writing.
Yes, I've kind of written a ton of short stories and a novel in the last few months. I actually sold a short story a few months ago to a small magazine called Story Hack Action and Adventure, and it should be appearing in issue 3, which I believe will be coming out in the next couple of months. I don't know exactly when, but I'm guessing August, September. Mm-hmm. That story is a story about it's a Grand Canyon park ranger finds herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with a gang of killers on the floor of the Grand Canyon in the middle of the summer, which is a very, very hot place to be and very dangerous. And it's actually one of the few times where you could make a character a fair-haired white girl and have it be key to the plot, because that's very dangerous skin condition to be when you're in the middle of the sunniest part of the desert in the summer. So, that story should be coming out soon, and I've written a bunch of other stories that are in various stages of pitch right now to magazines and junk. I've got some other ideas I have to actually write down, but I was put those aside because I was working on a novel that I just finished the first draft of yesterday.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. That is a crime novel. It's full of violence and swear words. So parents who bought your children Dr. Bananas, this might not be a good follow-up. But it's about when a beloved bartender disappears one night after her shift. Four of her patrons, an ex-cop, a criminal sociopath, her best friend from high school, and a wannabe rock star with a crush on her, all try to find her in their own ways. So so I just finished the first draft yesterday, so I'm going to let it rest for like a month and kind of let myself forget some of it. Just let it not be fresh in my mind so I can look at it with new eyes. And I've made some notes of stuff I already want to change, but I'm making a point of not touching it for at least a few weeks. So, but once that's done, I will go through the process of looking for an agent, looking for a publisher, then publishing it, selling it to Hollywood, forgetting all you losers, and living like a rich man.
So, who are some of your crime novel influences? Who are you really into?
I like Robert B. Parker, his Spencer for Hire now, or Spencer for Hire is the TV show.
Yeah.
I've read all but 5 of his novels. Or all 5 of the Spencer novels. I haven't read any of the Jesse Stones or the Sonny Randalls yet. I like a guy named Robert Crace, or Cray, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. He writes a series called Elvis Cole and Joe Pike. They're a couple of private investigators in L.A. I've read a few of the John McDonald, Travis McGee novels. Those are pretty good. Those are older, though. They're pretty solid. I've read. I don't know if you read. Did you ever read Mockingbird from Marvel Comics, the one that Chelsea Kane wrote?
Yeah, Chelsea Kane. Yeah, what was she just announced? They just announced her on something.
Vision.
Good for her. Yeah. I hope she does well with that.
But me too. I read one of her novels. I'd like to read more. I haven't yet. Lauren Bucus writes a combination. She writes modern fantasy and some are like crime stories too. She wrote this one called The Shining Girls. Yes, The Shining Girls,
and she also wrote a comic.
I have Amazon Prime, and they offer a free book a month for the Kindle, so I'll just download one of those every month just because I can, and I'll read those. So I read a lot of different crime fiction that way. I love really old stuff like Dashiell Hammett. He wrote The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man.
Right, Dashiell Hammett, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of his books. And I just saw they put out a giant big collection of all his Continental Op short stories. So I'd love to read those. From Stephen King, I said I read a lot of those, but his Mr. Mercedes trilogy was, for the most part, straight up crime. And those are really good. Especially the first 2.
Who is it who just fought Spencer? Was it Mark Wahlberg?
Yeah, Mark Wahlberg is going to be starring as Spencer in the new Spencer for Hire movies or series for Netflix, I think it is.
Right. I always love the Spencer books because I love how much detail he puts into what he's eating.
Yeah, I think we talked about this once on Facebook, how every time you could Boston restaurants would say the best thing that could happen to them is Robert Parker would go there for a meal because if he liked it, it would be in the next Spencer novel.
Right, yeah. And what was it? I don't know. I read all these books when I was very young. I remember the things that stuck out to me were he always emphasized how Jewish his girlfriend was.
Yep. And how Black Hawk is.
Yeah. Right. These were things that he had to really, really let you know about.
Yes, and just in case you were curious that whether or not a white man was friends with a black man.
It's totally normal. Ebony and Ivory, right there.
Exactly.
Really want you to know.
I'm trepidatious because I think Wahlberg would do a good job in the role, but I don't like he's just released from prison for some crime and stripped of his PI license.
Oh, is that what the take is?
Yeah, I mean, they're basing it on one of the Ace Atkins novels, but that element is new. It's completely new. So, I haven't read any of the Ace Atkins novels, but my best friend from back home, his dad was a big fan, and he's read them, and he says they're note perfect compared to what Parker used to write.
All right, cool. So, it's always interesting whenever somebody takes on the legacy of writing a franchise, I read all the James Bond novels. I read all the new ones that still come out. So what else can you tell me that's coming out right now? So we can go to Supernatural Suburbs and get that through the Patreon?
Yep, you can get Spooky Town or Dr. Bananas through Comixology, or find me at a convention. I'll be at quite a number of them in the next few months. I got SuperCon this weekend. I've got Soda City Comic Con down in South Carolina next month, and I've got SPX and Baltimore Comic Con in September.
Oh, nice. Look how busy you are.
I know. I wish I lived in Maryland because I will be there every other weekend of the month of September.
Don't you have any friends or contacts there?
Not in that part of Maryland.
Aw, boo. What's your dream job? What if you got hired to do, like, the comic adaptation of Ghost of Mrs. Muir?
Well, then I would say goodbye to you losers and head off and do it.
What about Casper? What if they gave you Casper? What would you do with him?
I'd actually do a Casper. So let's see here. I would bring back Casper and the Ghostly Trio, and let's see. I would put them into a haunted house, but I wouldn't do anything like where there's like people living in the house, because that's been done and it's cliched. But maybe like next door neighbors that they could like mess with, like some like crotchety old man keeps complaining about the kids next door, but there's no one there, and everyone thinks, oh, whatever, you're just a whiner. And hijinks would ensue. I mean, Casper wouldn't do that because he's the friendly ghost, but those other three would definitely do it. And I'm sure I'd work Wendy the Good Witch into that one too.
Yeah, Wendy has to guest star a lot. I want more Wendy.
Yeah, well, no jokes about you being the bad witch. So
where can we find you on social media? Where's your Patreon at, buddy?
Patreon is patreon.com/cartoonistluke. You can find me on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Snapchat, all at cartoonistluke. I'll friend you on Facebook if I know you, or if I know enough of our mutual friends that you're not a weirdo. Because I don't do that. I do a lot of like family and personal stuff on my Facebook, as well as promotion of my comics. So it's mostly the other places that you can find me easily. So basically just search for the words Cartoonist Luke, all one word, and you can find me somehow.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much.